At the pulpit stood Pastor Philip Jackson, his deep, resonant voice echoing through the sanctuary as he spoke of hope and redemption. To the congregation, he was the ideal man, successful, charming, and a proud father of 4 wonderful children. Few could imagine the devastating truth hidden beneath the surface of this picture-perfect family, a truth that would shake their lives and send shockwaves through the community. As Pastor Philip's gaze swept across the congregation, it lingered momentarily on his wife, Ellen, seated in the front row. Her calm, radiant smile gave no hint of the secrets she carried, secrets that would soon unravel everything they had built. This is the tale of how a man of faith fell from grace, how a respected leader became the source of tragedy, and how a single revelation led to a series of horrific events that would forever scar their neighborhood in Atlanta. Philip Jackson seemed destined for greatness. Born into a family of preachers, he had a natural gift for public speaking and an extraordinary ability to connect with people. His father, Reverend Isaiah Jackson, was a respected pastor in Atlanta's West End neighborhood during the 1970s, a time of hope and progress for the African American community. Following in his father's footsteps, Philip embraced his calling with passion. At just 25 years old, Philip took over as lead pastor of Graceful Redemption Church after his father retired. Under his leadership, the church thrived. The congregation grew, community programs expanded, and the church became a beacon of hope for the neighborhood. Philip's charisma and dedication made him a respected figure not just in the church, but throughout the community. At 28, Philip married Ellen Green, a kind and devoted woman who shared his love for ministry. Within 6 years, their family grew to include 4 children: Joshua, Caleb, Esther, and Ruth. To outsiders, the Jacksons seemed blessed beyond measure. Their charming Victorian-style home, just blocks from the church, was a welcoming space for congregants. Ellen was the perfect pastor's wife, active in church events, loving with their children, and supportive of Philip's mission. Together, they appeared to embody a life of faith, love, and purpose. Philip's influence grew with time. He fought for justice, better schools, and community improvements. By the time he turned 40, his achievements were remarkable. Graceful Redemption had over 3,000 members, a new community center, and even a school. Philip was invited to speak at conferences nationwide, and whispers of a potential political career began to circulate. On Sundays, the Jackson family was a vision of harmony. Philip, dressed impeccably, greeted congregants at the church doors alongside Ellen, who exuded grace and elegance. Their children, like stair-steps in age, mirrored their parents' warmth and charm. Joshua, at 12, already showed signs of following in his father's footsteps with his natural charisma. Caleb, 10, excelled in sports, while 8-year-old Esther was a budding pianist, and little Ruth, at 6, captured hearts with her angelic voice in the church choir. Everything about the Jacksons seemed flawless, but cracks had started to form in the foundation of their perfect world. Cracks that would soon widen into a chasm. It was a cool autumn morning when the first signs of trouble emerged. Ellen had taken Caleb to Grady Memorial Hospital for his annual checkup. At 10 years old, Caleb was in excellent health, strong, lean, and energetic from hours spent playing baseball and basketball. Dr. Amelia Carter, the family's trusted pediatrician, greeted them warmly. "How's my future baseball star today?" she teased, tousling Caleb's curls. "I hit 3 home runs last week." Caleb grinned, proudly showing the gap where a front tooth had recently fallen out. As Dr. Carter began the routine checkup, Ellen felt a familiar wave of pride. Caleb was so much like his father, determined and full of life. The exam went smoothly until Dr. Carter paused while reviewing Caleb's records. A small frown creased her brow. "Mrs. Jackson," Dr. Carter began cautiously, "I noticed we don't have Caleb's blood type on file. It's important to have that information, especially for an active child like him. Would you mind if we ran a quick blood test today?" Ellen nodded without hesitation. "Of course, whatever you think is best." A week later, Ellen received an unexpected call from Dr. Carter's office, asking her and Philip to come in for a consultation. Confused but not alarmed, they scheduled an appointment for the following day. As they sat in the doctor's office, hand in hand, they couldn't have imagined the news they were about to hear. Dr. Carter entered, her usually cheerful expression replaced with a serious one. "Mr. and Mrs. Jackson," she began gently, "I have some unusual findings from Caleb's blood test." Philip leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Is something wrong with our son?" Dr. Carter hesitated before responding. "Physically, Caleb is perfectly healthy. However, the blood test revealed something that doesn't add up. According to our records, you, Mr. Jackson, have type A blood, and you, Mrs. Jackson, have type B. But Caleb's blood type is O negative." Ellen blinked, unsure of what that meant. "Is that a problem?" she asked hesitantly. Dr. Carter's voice softened. "Given your blood types, it's not biologically possible for Caleb to be your biological child." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Philip stared at Dr. Carter, then turned to Ellen, expecting to see confusion that mirrored his own. Instead, what he saw froze him in place: guilt. The drive home was silent, the atmosphere thick with unspoken questions. As soon as they walked through the door, Philip's controlled demeanor shattered. "What's going on, Ellen?" His voice trembled with anger. "How is this possible?" Ellen sank onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "Philip, I can't explain," she stammered. Philip's voice grew quieter, but no less fierce. "It's not just Caleb, is it?" Ellen's silence was answer enough. Philip's world crumbled. Everything he thought he knew, his family, his marriage, his identity as a father, was a lie. Unable to contain his rage, he declared, "We're testing all the children." "Philip, please," Ellen pleaded, her eyes filled with tears. "Can't we just—" "No." Philip's voice cut through her protest. "We're going to find out the truth. All of it." Little did they know, this discovery was only the beginning of a nightmare that would destroy their lives and ripple through their community. In the days that followed, Philip moved with a grim determination. Without telling Ellen, he scheduled DNA tests for all 4 children. Under the pretense of a family outing, he took Joshua, Caleb, Esther, and Ruth to a discreet testing facility on the outskirts of Atlanta. The children, excited about the unexpected trip, were unaware of the true purpose. As the technicians swabbed their cheeks, Philip's emotions churned. Part of him desperately prayed for a mistake, hoping against all odds that the initial blood test had been wrong. But another, darker part of him was bracing for the worst. A week later, Philip sat alone in his study, staring at the unopened envelope containing the results. The children were at school, and Ellen was volunteering at the church's food bank. His hands trembled as he tore the envelope open and unfolded the papers. The clinical language of the report delivered a crushing blow. None of the children, not Joshua, not Caleb, not Esther, not Ruth, were biologically his. Philip sat in stunned silence, the papers clutched in his shaking hands. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner grew unbearably loud, marking the seconds of his life as it unraveled. How many sermons had he preached about honesty and fidelity? How many couples had he counseled, urging them to build their marriages on trust? All the while, his own marriage had been a lie. As the shock gave way to anger, a burning rage consumed him. He felt humiliated, betrayed, and utterly broken. Ellen, the woman he had loved and trusted, had deceived him for years. She had allowed him to pour his heart into raising children who weren't his, all while hiding the truth. When Ellen returned home that evening, she found Philip waiting for her in the living room. The children were spending the night at a church member's house, an arrangement Philip had made to ensure they wouldn't be home for what was to come. "Sit down, Ellen," he said, his voice eerily calm. "We need to talk." Ellen hesitated, sensing the storm brewing beneath his controlled exterior. Slowly, she sat on the edge of the armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Philip held up the DNA test results. I had the children tested, he said, his eyes boring into hers. None of them are mine, Ellen. Not a single one. Ellen's face crumpled as sobs broke through her defenses. Philip, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. Never meant for what, Ellen? Philip interrupted, his voice rising. Never meant to lie to me for 12 years? Never meant to pass off another man's children as mine? Never meant for me to find out? Tears streamed down Ellen's face as she shook her head. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I love you, Philip. I've always loved you. Love. Philip spat the word as though it were poison. If this is love, Ellen, I'd hate to see what betrayal looks like. He leaned forward, his expression dark. Who is the father? Ellen's silence stretched on, broken only by her quiet sobs. Who is it? Philip roared, making her flinch. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Ellen said, Jeremiah. The name struck Philip like a physical blow. Jeremiah Simons, his mentor, his friend, the senior pastor who had taken him under his wing when he first entered the ministry. The man who had officiated their wedding. How long? Philip asked, his voice hollow. Ellen's answer came reluctantly. Since before we were married. Philip's hands clenched into fists as he stood, his body trembling with rage. The betrayal was too great to bear. The man he had trusted most had been the one to destroy him. At that moment, something inside Philip Jackson broke. The man who had been a compassionate pastor, a loving father, and a devoted husband was gone. In his place stood someone consumed by rage and pain, someone who couldn't see past the betrayal that had destroyed his world. Ellen must have sensed the change in him because she stood up suddenly, backing away. Philip, she said, her voice trembling, please, we can work this out. For the children. The children? Philip's laugh was hollow, devoid of warmth. They're not my children, Ellen. They never were. Ellen's back hit the wall as Philip stepped closer. Panic filled her eyes as she searched for an escape. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry. Let's get counseling. We can fix this. Fix this? Philip hissed, his voice a low growl. How do you fix 12 years of lies, Ellen? How do you fix loving children you now know aren't yours? How do you fix building a life on a foundation of betrayal? Ellen's voice broke as she whispered, I didn't mean to hurt you, Philip. I didn't. But Philip wasn't listening anymore. The anger surging inside him had reached its boiling point. You didn't mean to hurt me, he roared, his voice echoing through the house. You lied to me every single day, for 12 years, and you didn't mean to hurt me? Ellen raised her hands in a defensive gesture, but Philip took another step forward, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Desperate, Ellen brought her knee up sharply, connecting with Philip's groin. He grunted in pain, staggering back just enough for her to slip past him. Ellen ran, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. She didn't stop to think. Her instincts screamed at her to get to safety. She darted into the kitchen, slamming the door behind her and fumbling with the lock. It clicked into place just as Philip's body slammed against the other side of the door. Ellen, he shouted, his voice no longer the calm baritone she had known for years, but a raw, furious growl. Open this door. Ellen's eyes darted around the kitchen as she tried to think. Her purse. Where was her purse? She needed her phone to call for help. But before she could find it, the door began to splinter under Philip's relentless pounding. She spotted the purse on the counter and lunged for it, dumping its contents onto the floor. Lipstick, keys, wallet, but no phone. Panic gripped her as the door burst open, sending shards of wood flying into the room. Philip stepped into the kitchen, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with fury. No more running, Ellen, he said, his voice eerily calm. It's time to face what you've done. Ellen grabbed a knife from the counter and held it out in front of her, the blade trembling in her unsteady grip. Stay back, Philip, she warned. I don't want to hurt you. Philip laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. Hurt me? You've already done that, Ellen. You've hurt me in ways I didn't even know were possible. He lunged toward her, and Ellen slashed wildly with the knife. She felt it connect, saw the red stain spreading across Philip's shirt, and heard his sharp intake of breath. But it wasn't enough to stop him. He grabbed her wrist, squeezing until the knife fell from her hand and clattered to the floor. With his other hand, he grabbed a fistful of her hair and yanked her head back. "I gave you everything," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "My love, my trust, my life, and you threw it all away." Ellen's world blurred as Philip slammed her head against the counter. Once, twice, 3 times. Blood trickled down her face, and her vision swam with black spots. "Philip," she mumbled weakly, her voice slurring. "Please, the children." But Philip was beyond reason. His mind, warped by betrayal and rage, saw only one way to erase the pain, the humiliation, the lies. Ellen's voice faded into silence as darkness claimed her. As the first light of dawn crept through the kitchen windows, Philip Jackson stood in the middle of a scene of unimaginable horror. Blood stained the white tiles, stark and unforgiving, as the metallic scent hung heavy in the air. He looked down at his trembling hands, now covered in dried blood, and a wave of nausea washed over him. What had he done? How had he, a man of God, a shepherd to his flock, fallen so far? Philip's mind raced, veering between regret and a cold, detached clarity. Part of him recoiled at the sight before him, but another part, darker and unrecognizable, whispered that the sin had been erased, that the betrayal had been answered. The realization of what lay ahead began to dawn on him. He couldn't stay here. If anyone found out his ministry, his reputation, his freedom, everything would be gone. He had to act. He had to clean up, cover his tracks, and disappear. As he methodically set about his grim task, his thoughts turned to the children, Joshua, Caleb, Esther, and Ruth. They would wake up soon, expecting to return home to their parents, only to find their lives turned upside down. Philip paused, a pang of guilt cutting through his haze of resolve. Despite everything, he had loved them. He had raised them as his own. But they weren't his. They were living reminders of Ellen's betrayal. "No," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "It's better this way. A clean break. A fresh start." By the time the sun rose fully over Atlanta, Philip had disappeared, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. That morning, Deacon Walter Green pulled into the Jacksons' driveway, the Jackson children in tow after their sleepover at another church member's house. Walter had promised to bring them home, and he planned to surprise the family with breakfast. As the children tumbled out of the car, chattering excitedly, Walter noticed something unusual. The front door was slightly ajar. His brow furrowed. "That's strange," he muttered. "Kids, wait here for a moment." Walter pushed the door open, calling out, "Philip? Ellen? It's Walter. We're back with the kids." Silence greeted him, heavy and unsettling. The steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room was the only sound. Stepping cautiously inside, Walter was immediately struck by a sharp, metallic smell that made his stomach churn. His calls grew more urgent as he moved toward the kitchen. "Philip? Ellen?" Turning the corner, Walter froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sight before him was unthinkable. The kitchen, once filled with warmth and laughter, was now a scene of unimaginable violence. Blood was everywhere, on the tiles, the countertops, even the walls. And at the center of it all lay Ellen Jackson's lifeless body. Walter staggered back, his hands flying to his mouth as bile rose in his throat. His mind struggled to process the horror before him. This couldn't be real. Not Philip and Ellen. Not the family everyone admired. With trembling hands, he fumbled for his phone and dialed 911. There's been a murder," he stammered, barely able to form the words. "It's Ellen Jackson at the Jackson house." As he spoke to the dispatcher, a new wave of dread hit him. The children. They were still outside, oblivious to the nightmare inside. How could he shield them from this? How could he protect them from the truth that would shatter their world. Minutes later, the quiet street was transformed into chaos as flashing lights and wailing sirens filled the neighborhood. Police cars and ambulances surrounded the Jackson home. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering in shock and disbelief. Detective Aisha Carter arrived on the scene, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. At 38, Aisha was one of Atlanta's most respected homicide detectives, known for her unwavering determination. As she stepped into the blood-soaked kitchen, she braced herself for the horror she had seen too many times before. "What do we know so far?" she asked a uniformed officer. The young officer swallowed hard before answering. "The victim is Ellen Jackson, 39, wife of Pastor Philip Jackson. 4 children, none of whom were home at the time. The husband, he's missing, detective. His car is gone." Aisha frowned, her instincts kicking in. A missing spouse was always suspicious, especially in cases like this. But Philip Jackson wasn't just any husband. He was a beloved pastor, a community leader, a man many saw as the embodiment of faith and integrity. Could he really be capable of such violence? "Put out a bolo for Pastor Jackson and his vehicle," she instructed. "And I want everything we can get on this family, phone records, financials, the works." Something led to this, and we're going to find out what it was. As the CSI team began their meticulous work, Aisha stepped outside for a breath of air. Her eyes fell on the Jackson children, huddled together under blankets by a police car. Their faces were pale, their eyes red from crying. Aisha's chest tightened. This was the part of the job she hated most, facing the innocent lives left behind. She approached them slowly, crouching to their level. "Hi there," she said gently. "I'm Detective Carter. Can you tell me your names?" The eldest, Joshua, spoke up. "I'm Joshua. These are my siblings, Caleb, Esther, and Ruth." His voice cracked as he asked, "Where's Mom? Where's Dad?" "No one will tell us anything." Aisha hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Something bad has happened," she said softly. "Your mom, she's been hurt very badly. We're doing everything we can to find out what happened. And to find your dad." Caleb, his voice trembling, asked, "Why can't we see her?" Aisha felt her throat tighten. How could she explain the unexplainable? "I'm so sorry," she said gently. "You can't see her right now. But we're going to make sure you're safe. That's what matters most." Philip, consumed by betrayal and rage, called Pastor Jeremiah Simons, demanding a meeting. Jeremiah, terrified but knowing he couldn't avoid the confrontation, agreed to meet Philip at his church office. Philip arrived, disheveled and unrecognizable, his anger barely contained. The tension between the two men reached a boiling point as Philip accused Jeremiah of betraying him and destroying his life. As the confrontation escalated, Philip revealed the extent of his anguish, blaming Jeremiah for the years of lies and the loss of everything he held dear. Jeremiah, desperate to defuse the situation, pleaded for forgiveness and urged Philip to think of the children. But Philip's grief and rage left him unmoved. Meanwhile, Detective Aisha Carter and her team tracked Philip to the church. Arriving just as the situation spiraled out of control, Aisha ordered her officers to surround the building and prepare to intervene. Inside, the confrontation turned violent. Philip, armed and unstable, pointed a gun at Jeremiah, his anger overwhelming any sense of reason. With seconds to act, Aisha and her team stormed the office. In the chaos, Philip turned the weapon on the officers, forcing Aisha to fire. Philip was struck and, with his final breath, whispered a prayer for forgiveness before succumbing to his wounds. The tragedy left the Atlanta community in shock. Ellen was mourned, Philip's actions were condemned, and Jeremiah resigned, consumed by guilt. The Jackson children were taken in by Ellen's sister and began the long journey of healing, supported by a loving family. Detective Carter, hailed as a hero, struggled with the emotional weight of the case, but resolved to use the lessons from the Jackson story to prevent similar tragedies. The once thriving Graceful Redemption Church was abandoned, later repurposed as a community center. The story of Philip and Ellen Jackson became a cautionary tale of the destructive power of secrets, betrayal, and unchecked anger. Though their lives ended in tragedy, their children worked to rebuild, creating a legacy of resilience, truth, and hope.